I'm Ed Adams, and you're listening to the AAFCA podcast. Welcome to another episode of the AAFCA podcast, and today we're geeking out a bit to discuss comic books, the movies inspired by them, and if Hollywood is overlooking opportunities in independent Black comic books. I'll explain more after the break. The AAFCA podcast is sponsored by Morgan Stanley Global Sports and Entertainment. Captain America, Thor, Iron Man, the Black Panther. These are just a few of the heroes in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that have changed the landscape of movie tentpole franchises. In the past, this title was primarily held by franchises like Star Wars, Star Trek, and Harry Potter. But no more. Comic books are in, and Hollywood just can't get enough of them. 2018's box office for superhero-based films totaled over $5.6 billion internationally. To give you some perspective, that is more revenue than all Star Wars movies produced since 2015 combined at $4.8 billion in international revenue. And here's why. According to a study conducted by the ICV2, an outlet dedicated to the geek culture industry, roughly 30% of the comic book buying public are people of color, which nearly parallels the country's demographic makeup, with whites totaling 76% of the population according to the 2010 U.S. Census report. But check this out. A Motion Picture Association of America 2016 report stated that people of color account for 59% of all box office tickets sold domestically. So it got me thinking, with people of color so invested in Hollywood's success, should more Black comic book characters, and more importantly, independent comic book publishers, see their works and characters on the big screen?
I just remember that feeling of like how impressive that movie was and how it just really just hit so many different aspects of the Black and the African American and the African diaspora.
That's Shawn Martinbrough describing his feels about Marvel's blockbuster hit Black Panther. Shawn is a comic illustrator who has worked on some of the biggest comic book titles around. He's drawn iconic characters like Batman, Captain America, The Punisher, Luke Cage, and the Black Panther. I had a chance to interview Shawn recently to discuss his work, his process, and his thoughts on Hollywood's investment in comics. So Shawn, welcome to the AAFCA podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
I was really fascinated by your book, How to Draw Noir Comics and the Art and Technique of Visual Storytelling. Can you tell us a little bit about your book?
Yeah, like How to Draw the Noir Comics, the Art and Technique of Visual Storytelling was a book that I did for Random House and Watson Guptill Publishing. It was a great opportunity because I've been working on a number of projects back to back for Marvel and DC, and it was a great opportunity to sort of encapsulate my approach to storytelling in a instructional form. Because over the years, whenever you do, as an artist, you'll go to conventions, or if you do speaking engagements, people will ask you a ton of questions. Like I would always be approached by, maybe moms, dads, aspiring artists, asking questions. Hey, how can I develop my style? How can I get into the industry? And so I thought that just putting all of this into a book would be like a great way to sort of, get my, just sort of spread my ideas out to the masses in a different way.
When I was reading information about your book, one of the things that kind of reminds me is that, comic book panels are very similar to movie storyboards. And your particular style kind of fits into a narrative that we see in movies all the time, especially franchises. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing about comic book panels is that there's no sort of one way to do it. You always have to serve the storytelling, but there are a lot of artists that are a lot more sort of dynamic with their panel layout. Me, I tend to be a bit more conservative with the panel layout because I want to focus more on what's in the panel. So as a result, I really just want to use the entire width of the frame so I can play with foreground, middle ground, and background. And since I'm a huge film and TV buff, and I study film and I study television shows for years in terms of like how stories are told and how things are framed, it just organically, I just sort of, started using panels that would be maybe like 4 rectangular panels on a page. And also when I was working with a former editor-in-chief, Axel Alonso, over at Marvel, he really encouraged me to sort of just give myself room. And he was like, listen, I'm going to give you scripts that are not going to be overwritten or have too much dialogue, but I want you to have room to really play with the visual storytelling. So from there, I just started primarily doing panels in long, widescreen tabular formats. But I think that where you're going with in terms of Hollywood looking at comic books as a blueprint or a guideline to seeing a property that could be adapted to film and television, sure. And I find that it's funny that a lot of people in Hollywood don't like to read. So the less words that they can, sort of have to read to get the viability of the project, the better. And also comic books, come with images. Comic books are a true balance of images and words. And so if you can, so as opposed to a novel where you have to really sit there and read and really, visualize it yourself, if you have someone who's visualizing it for you, it's like they're doing half of the work for you. So it's easy to say, okay, I can see this on the big screen.
You have drawn several books for the Black Panther series from Marvel. Talk about your thoughts about the success of the movie.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be approached by Marvel to work on the final arc of the long-running series for Black Panther. So they had said, hey, listen, we're going to be winding down the series, and we'd like you to work on this final story. And I was like, okay, great. I hadn't worked on Black Panther at all, and I had no idea what was going on with the character. So it was really great to sort of jump in and say, okay, so Black Panther is now working out of Hell's Kitchen, which is Daredevil's territory. Listen, growing up, I was a huge fan of the Black Panther, and I was like, okay, whenever I get a project from Marvel or DC and it's the character that I've never drawn before, I try to approach that character in a unique way. And so for me, I'm thinking, okay, the Black Panther, how can I wanted to try to visualize him as sort of cat-like and kind of like, slinking around corners and really almost walking on all fours when he would, sort of move around the environments. And that was really fun to do. So that was that miniseries that I did. That was like the last story arc that I did for Marvel for the Black Panther. That was great. And then fast forward, because I did that maybe back in around 2010-ish. Mm-hmm. And so fast forward 8 years to the feature film. I mean, I was just so impressed. I mean, I just thought that they blew it out the box. Ryan Coogler and, everybody involved in that film was just firing on all cylinders. And I like my wife. It's funny because my wife was saying, "Hey, listen, since you worked on Black Panther, why don't you see if you can get some passes for the premiere?" And I'm like, "What? Wait, what do I look like, Michael B. Jordan here? I mean, I don't know." So she's like, "Well, just ask." So I reached out to the guys at Marvel Comics, and then a couple of weeks later, they were like, "Hey, listen, good news. We got passes for you and your wife to go to the premiere." And I'm like, "Wow, okay, cool." We flew out there, went to the premiere, and it was such it was an incredible experience because you're being in the theater surrounded by, you got celebrities, and we were sitting in the section with fellow artists that had worked for Marvel, and but seeing everybody just sort of fanning out, mm-hmm. Equally on like the same kind of level. And then the cast came out, they spoke before the movie played. And I was just blown away. And I still get chills at those end credits because I just remember that feeling of like how impressive that movie was and how it just really just hit so many different aspects of the Black and the African American and the African diaspora. It just killed. And then it just was just entertaining as a Marvel movie and fit within the Marvel universe. Man, I was blown away.
You mentioned something I kind of want to take a step back, and I think it may be helpful to the listeners. Talked about when you're in your creative process. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that particular thing. When you are looking at a character or when you're given a character or you have to create a character, what is your process? How do you approach and how do you create them?
Well, I guess my process, it always starts with the script, because the way comic books are made, it's an assembly line. So you have your editor that assigns a writer, to write a script or a story. And then the writer writes a 20-page script that's very similar in its format to a film or television teleplay or a screenplay. And so I'll read that. As the artist, I get the script, and then I have to what I do is I'll read the script once, so I kind of get the story down, and then I'll start doing layouts, little thumbnails. So these are really simple, very simple line layouts, just sort of figuring out what goes in each panel and the angles, the lighting. And then once I kind of edit that and refine that layout to, the way I like it or to what I think works best for the page, that'll be my blueprint. And then I'll use that as the blueprint to draw the final page. So, and then for me, like I really try to make the writer's words come alive on the panel. So my job is, like, if I read a scene where someone's jumping out of a car in the middle of the street, my job is to make that as dynamic as possible and serve the story and just make the writer's words come alive. And so after I draw that, then it goes to the letterer. They add the letters digitally, and then it goes to the colors digitally. And all along the while, the editor's cracking the whip, telling everyone to go faster. And then all of these files digitally get sent to the editor. He puts them all together. They put the book together, and then it gets shipped off to Canada. And then you get a printed copy a couple of weeks later, or sometimes maybe a week or two later. It depends on how tight the deadline is. But so my process really is just sort of visualize the script. And whenever I have to create a character, it's like I said, it always starts with the way the character is written. Now, for example, Thief of Thieves was something that Robert Kirkman had come to me, and I had to design that universe from the ground up because it wasn't pre-existing. So, for example, like if you work on Batman, Batman is that's an established character. So DC Comics will give you a visual guide to how Batman currently looks, and you really have to follow that guide. You might take some liberties with the length of the cape or the ears, but for the most part, everything else has to be drawn exactly the way he looks in the guide. So that gives you some structure. Same thing with Black Panther or any other established character, unless they're really doing like a total remake of that character, and then it's on you, and you can have some freedom creatively. But with something like Thief of Thieves, which is like a brand new intellectual property, like that was on me to sort of create the looks and the designs of each character. And that's fun because then you get to say, okay, well, based on this character, the way he's written, like our lead character for Thief of Thieves, his name is Conrad Paulson. He's an international thief, and he's got an ex-wife and a son that he's trying to sort of make his relationship work with them. He's got his own group of thieves that he goes around and pulls these heists with around the world. So for me, when I had the character of Conrad Paulson given to me, I'm like, okay, clearly I'm thinking that Kirkman wanted this to be a white guy, and his wife was white and his son was white, but everyone else Kirkman wasn't specific about. So I said, okay, you know what? For me, representation is very important, and I know that growing up as a black kid from the Bronx, it was important for me to see myself represented in comics or television or film. And so if I get a story and a character isn't specified as a certain ethnicity, I'll make them a person of color. And if a person isn't specified exactly as a man or woman, or it seems like I can get some wiggle room, I'll try to maybe gender bend them and make them a woman, just to diversify things to reflect the world around me. So even though like the main family unit of Thief of Thieves is a white couple, a white family, everyone around them is surrounded by people of color. And his thieves, I really wanted to make them totally diverse in terms of coming from different walks of life. And so, and because since I'm a native New Yorker, I've just grown up being around people, different people from different walks of life. So that to me is just normal. And so, for example, like one of his crew looks like Ghostface Killer from like Wu-Tang. The female, she was kind of written to be a stripper who kind of steals stuff on the side. And this is a situation where you kind of feel like you think that the writers are kind of going in a certain direction. And because I think they gave her like a a black woman sounding name, but they didn't say she was a black woman. And I said, okay, let me make her a blonde hair, blue-eyed white girl, just to switch that up. And they were cool with it.
Oh,
you know,
nice.
and that's the really cool thing about working with Kirkman and on this project, is that he's given me a ton of leeway just to sort of create. And I always tell this story. Conrad, our lead character in Thief of Thieves, he has an FBI agent who's been trying to bring him down, and her name is Elizabeth Cohen. And Kirkman he sent me a basic idea of her character and her motivations, but he didn't say anything about how she looked. So I said, you know what, let me switch it up. So I designed her as a black female. And I sent him the design, and he said, oh, Cohen's black now. Cool. And just like that, I made a character, a black female. And so that's pretty much like my process is, in addition to trying to make the characters look interesting, look distinct, and have a certain swagger about them, a certain attitude, a certain presence, I try to diversify as well, because that's just, like I said, the world that I see around me, and it just makes things a lot more interesting to diversify things.
One of the things that we talk a lot about lately, which the passing of Stan Lee was his impact, especially for people of color. He took a lot of risks to kind of create black characters and tell black stories, but I don't think we've ever given Dwayne McDuffie his due. And I would love for you to kind of talk to me about his impact for that. Well,
I met Dwayne probably during my college years. I was introduced to him through a mentor of mine by the name of Michael Davis. And just to kind of give a little brief history of that, when I was in high school, I went to Fiorello LaGuardia High School Performing Arts and Music and Art. And that's the Fame School with the whole movie with the kids dancing on the tables and stuff. Mm-hmm. And that was the school's in New York. And then a buddy of mine, he was a fellow comic book fan. He was like, listen, I'm taking a cartooning class up in Harlem. It's for free. It's really cool. You should come. So I said, okay, cool. So I went with him, and that's where I met Michael Davis. And Davis was a comic book, he was an illustrator who was teaching a cartooning class for free. And it was great. He really exposed us to a lot of the inner workings of the business to being an artist. And he really introduced me to a lot of working professionals at the time, like Bill Sienkiewicz or Dennis Cowan, Walt Simonson. They're just a slew of people that are just industry veterans and titans that he introduced us to, which was awesome. So that really, really helped push me because I knew that I wanted to be a comic book artist, but this really gave me the inspiration to really attack it like a business. So I went and got my first work from Marvel Comics while I was a junior at the School of Visual Arts. And once I was working for Marvel, then Milestone was created. And so since I knew Davis, and then he had introduced me to Dennis, and I knew a lot of the people that worked at Milestone, they were friends. When I would drop work off at Marvel, which was on Park Avenue, it was maybe a 15-minute walk from there to the Milestone offices, and I would go to Milestone and hang out. And that's when I started doing work for Milestone. I started inking Static, which is one of their core titles. I got my hands on the Milestone Bible, which is something that Dwayne had written. They all had all worked together to come up with the idea. In addition to Christopher Priest, who's sort of like the fifth Beatle of the Milestone universe. But Dwayne had written this incredible Bible for the Milestone universe, which I have to this day, because it's just one of the best things I've ever read. And Dwayne was just ahead of his time with regard to just touching on topics, dealing with the black community that comic books really were not touching back then. And it's sad because Milestone was sort of pegged as black comics, but they were really just diverse comics.
Right.
And the main core characters they happen to be black, but the stories that the characters were really dealing with were universal in a large part. And I just think that Dwayne's the whole concept of Hardware, who you could say he was sort of in the Iron Man vein, but he had a real kind of different slant to him. He created Icon and Static, which Icon was this conservative black Superman, and he was paired with this young, progressive black female, the Robin to his Batman. It was just great stuff. And I just really respected what Dwayne did and was trying to do with comic books. And I will always be inspired by his legacy with Milestone. But then, of course, he went on to write, like, he was like working on the Justice League cartoon, I believe, and just a lot of things in animation. But I think he was just a very, very talented writer. And I think that he just had such a great vision that, it was just inspiring. And the sad thing is, unfortunately, sometimes people get pigeonholed because they think that, okay, if you're the black writer or artist, let's get you working on a black character. I think the thing that was great about Dwayne is that he pushed past that and said, listen, yeah, of course I can write black characters, but I can write, the best of the best white characters in the DC universe as well.
Yeah.
And he showed that. I think that that's really important to sort of, break stereotypes and preconceived notions of who can write what.
Just in this year alone, 2 movies stand out that have made over $2.5 billion, Black Panther and Avengers Infinity War. Are superheroes here to stay, in your opinion, or?
No, I think they're here to stay. And I think that Marvel has shown that if you pay the source material the proper respect, you can keep going for infinity. Because growing up, I was a huge Marvel Comics fan, more than DC, but I did have my DC titles that I was a huge fan of. But there's so many great stories in comics that they've barely scratched the surface on. It's ridiculous. And it's really sad for me that comic books don't get the due. They don't get the respect that they're due in this country the way they do around the world. And it's an American art form. You go to like Europe or in Asia, they really see comic books as an art form, a sophisticated art form. Here, people are like, oh, what are that? Comics? Those are for kids. And like, there's so many great stories. Like, you could, if they did them right, you can get like a slew of X-Men movies for like the next 20 years, based on the really great stories that that Marvel's put out. And so I think that comic book movies are here to stay. And I think that as long as they treat them with respect and they understand that in certain cases they have to update and diversify the material, because things that came out or things that flew back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, even the 80s or the 90s won't fly in 2018, 2019. Like thinking about the Black Panther movie, and when they said that
man-ape,
I think it was the man-ape. Yeah, like they knew that wasn't going to fly, calling the guy man-ape in 2018. So you know what I mean. So you have to make those course corrections, and so as long as you understand that, and you can adapt the material to make it better, or you can make the material relevant today. I mean, come on, they have a long life ahead of them. And for me, I think that one of the most impressive things that Marvel did was making Captain America cool. But what Marvel did, they didn't try to make him dark or brooding or sarcastic or whatever. They embraced the fact that he's a square guy, because you're having this square guy who really doesn't change his core values. He changes everyone else.
All right, I'm with it. School me when I need to be schooled. But no, I do agree with you. Like, representation is always going to, I think we're seeing more and more of that. But I also feel this, and I would love your opinion on this. One of the things that we talk a lot about is the idea that, instead of sitting at the big table, just create your own. And we're starting to see that a lot. What we've talked about with these new comic books and new and this idea that we are storytellers and we have our own unique stories to tell. What is your take on what is a lesson that Hollywood can learn from just absorbing and understanding our culture by having more people at the table, or just creating our own and doing what we need to do to represent ourselves?
Well, I think both needs to happen. And, and both can happen simultaneously. So, for example, like I've spent the majority of my career working for Marvel, DC, Dark Horse, like established comic book companies working on established brands. So for me, I feel like I've gotten all the practice that I can use. And not to say that, there's nothing more to learn, because life is a continuous learning lesson. But I've been schooled, I think, well enough that I can tell my own stories. And so I'm totally ready now to, get into film and television with original ideas and original properties for film and TV, because I know how to tell a story. And some time ago, I had actually taken time off from comics, and I had directed a couple of short films, which was it's probably like the most fun I've ever had in my life, working with actors and being able to direct a scene and not have to draw it. And that's one of the fascinating things about how the skill sets for comic book artists are very similar to directing, because as a comic book artist, I am the cinematographer, I am the set designer, I'm the lighting guy, I am the ward, the costumer, I am the location scout, I am the editor in a lot of ways in terms of how panels flow. So I am very comfortable telling a story visually and saying, okay, we need this scene here. And working with some of the top writers in the industry over the course of my career, I really have absorbed how, really good writers can construct a scene.
That again was Shawn Martinbrough. You can learn more about Shawn, his impressive collection of comic work, and his book, How to Draw Noir Comics, The Art and Technique of Visual Storytelling, by visiting his website at shawnmartinsbrough.com, and check out his TED Talk on YouTube. Up next, we speak to an independent comic book publisher and get his thoughts on the subject.
But I definitely think that the comic industry is still a little afraid to totally embrace a movement toward, filling their shelves with, diversity.
That dude right there, that's Carlton Hargro, co-publisher with his brother, Derek, at 20th Place Media. Carlton is not only a walking, talking comic book encyclopedia, but a culture critic and former editor of Creative Loafing newspapers in Atlanta and Charlotte. I spoke with Carlton recently to get his take on the appeal of comics to Hollywood and some insights on being an independent in the comic book industry. Well, Carlton, welcome to the AAFCA podcast.
Thanks, Ed. Nice to be here, man. Thanks for inviting me.
So before we get into the conversations, why don't you tell me about your venture into being an independent comic book creator?
Okay, well, actually, my brother Derek and myself have a publishing group called 20th Place Media, and it's named after the street that we grew up on, 20th Place in Gary, Indiana. And we actually published comics. We started publishing comics in the 90s. And we put a book out in 94 and did some stuff like 94 to 95. And then it wasn't really selling at the time. It was a whole different market. And we stopped doing it and regrouped and kind of tweaked all the books we were wanting to work on. And then years later, many years later, we started back up again, probably about 3 years ago. And now we put out sort of refurbished versions of some of those characters and under this new banner, 20 Place Media. And all the stuff we do is African American themed, but our idea is to really kind of challenge many of the stereotypes that you see in media featuring Black people. So we try to shy away from stuff that's been done to death, like drugs and hip hop artists or a basketball player or whatever, the stuff that, typically the traps that, I think we fell into in the past in terms of representation. And we want to really kind of put some different images out there. So that's really the goal with what we're doing.
Okay. All right. So a question that I was curious about is, why do you think superheroes are now such a big part of our culture?
Well, I think let's go like this. When Hollywood and television, movies and television, when they're looking for sort of these bigger franchises that can fuel a lot of money, I think superheroes it's a great well to dip into, because you have these long-standing stories that you can do decades of movies and television shows based off of. There's such a rich body of a catalog of work that you have to choose from. I think, let's put it like this. Back in the day when Hollywood first started, most of the stuff they did was based on books. So most movies, I can say most, maybe I would say at least 50% of the movies that came out were based on books. And so this is just another source. I just think the thing about it is it's such a perfect source. You've got these really larger-than-life characters. these very epic stories. Like I said, it's a lot of stories to choose from that you can adapt. So I just think it's kind of a perfect adaptable media. And it works really well on television because, look, if you've been publishing a comic book for 50, 60 years, you can get 13 episodes out of it pretty easily. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So whereas you take a show like Lost, you know, the first season may be really good, but then you sort of got to pull the rest out of wherever because you don't know what to do with the story. But here's stuff that's been already researched, developed, market tested, and so people know there's an audience for this stuff. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the perfect. You kind of wonder what took them so long to get to comic books, to the degree that they're being adapted now. But I think it's a perfect medium.
The other part of that is, you know, when you look at all these different comic books that are coming out, you know, a lot of it is really more the mainstream books. But
yeah.
what about the independents? Do you see the opportunities there?
Well, let's go like this. I mean, I think there's some indie books that are getting some love. I mean, now of course, even in independents, you have independents that are geared more toward white folks. You know, they're starring white characters or characters from the mainstream culture, and then you have independents that are from more marginalized groups.
Right.
So if you look at like the more white indie stuff, you got a new Spawn movie coming out, which Spawn actually stars an African American character, but it's created by a white guy, Todd McFarlane. He's got a new movie coming out in a little bit, starring Jamie Foxx, and Jeremy Renner is supposed to be in it. Mark Miller's the guy who created Wanted, and he created Kick-Ass and Kingsman. So for Netflix, he's doing a bunch of new shows. It's not the stuff that he's already done. So it's stuff that he hasn't yet adapted into movies or television. But he's a guy who he owns all this stuff himself. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Is not owned by a corporation. Of course, the biggest indie comic creator that had his stuff adapted into television and film is Robert Kirkman, who does The Walking Dead. So The Walking Dead is the success story of indie creators. Everybody wants to be Robert Kirkman. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Now, not only does he now have he has The Walking Dead, but he signed a deal, I think, with Amazon, with Skybound, his company. So they also do video games now. They do board games. They do all kind of stuff based on the characters that he creates. He has some other books, some other creators that he brought along, but a lot of the stuff is really fueled by his stuff. So there are some indie guys who are doing some big stuff. Now, when you look at sort of the black creators or characters, let's look at these creators who are creating characters who are from marginalized groups or people of color, you don't see a lot of adaptation on that front. Now, I will say that's a smaller pool of people to choose from, too. There's not a lot of real strong properties that have been out there long enough and made a lot of noise from the black indie community. There are a few. You got stuff like Brother Man, you know, that's really big. And that's been around since the 90s. That guy actually lives in the city of Atlanta. The brothers, the Sims brothers, and they just put out a new graphic novel, I think, last year, based on the Brother Man storyline. So they're keeping it going. They've been around for a long time, and I think it's a very influential book. And then you have I think Milestone could actually still be considered an indie, imprint, even though they're under the DC banner. They have rights to all those characters, and I think those characters don't happen unless they say we're going to do them or not.
Now, so you think that there will be a Static movie?
I don't know about that, but I mean, there's been. I'm just saying. I think if you're going to adapt anybody's stuff, it's going to be Milestone or it's going to be Brother Man. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I don't really see who else has enough body of work out there to really show people, hey, this is really viable. You know what I mean?
Okay.
There's not a lot of guys or anybody people of color wise that are indie publishers who have that much of a track record right now.
So give me some school us on this independent thing, because I'm assuming it's a lot different. When you have an idea, you want to create a comic book, I think, my first impression is that you would send it off to DC or Marvel.
Well, not for, let's put it like this. If you have an idea that you want to get, okay, you created a comic book, the first thing you should do is not go to Marvel or DC. Because if you go to Marvel or DC, they will own your character at this point. Now, they do have some creator-owned deals that they do through, like, Vertigo, DC does, and they have some, like, the Milestone deal, which is, kind of an interesting co-ownership type thing. And Marvel has dabbled in creative-owned stuff, but for the most part, your stuff is going to be owned by Marvel, and you might get points or royalties off of that, but you just don't have control over your stuff anymore. It's better to go to a publisher that has a model set up for creator-owned stuff. So Image is the real big one. So Image does Spawn, Image does Walking Dead. They do a lot of big comics like that. But with Image, you totally own your book, totally outright. Image doesn't shop it to any movie studios or nothing. They just publish the comics. Dark Horse is another one where Dark Horse does own some of their properties. They do licensed stuff, but they also do creator-owned stuff. But with their creator-owned stuff, like, so Hellboy is a creator-owned property that's at Dark Horse. So, but Dark Horse will shop your movie around to people without your consent, so to speak. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
so each comic book publisher basically has their own kind of set of rules that they follow.
Exactly.
Okay. And you have to kind of buyer beware if you want to shop your book to them.
Totally. You have to know what you get in store. I mean, everybody give you a contract, and you have to kind of go through it and kind of figure out what's going to be the best thing for you.
Okay.
So I would say, but the other side of it is, if you're an indie comic publisher, you can, just like you can make a movie on your own, it's very easy to make a comic book. I mean, you just need some money, you don't need that much, and you need places to put it. So you need to create the book, and you need to find some stores that will carry the book or sell it online or whatever you want to do. There's digital publishing, you could sell it online and mail it, however you want to do it. So you don't really need to go through a publisher. A publisher will get you to more people, of course, but that's not, the main thing is you make it, it's yours.
Okay. Now, how did you first get into comics? And just curious.
Well, I started reading comics when I was like 5 years old, and I think at 5 years old I said, hey, I want to publish comic books for a living. I mean, I knew what I wanted to do, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I collected comics for like 40-something years, and so I've always been drawn to the medium. It's the one thing I haven't really been able to shake as far as an interest. And then the more I read, the more that I read about the business side and learning about distribution and learning about publishing and the creators and the history of the books and all that stuff. I'm the nerd that I would have my mother drop me over to the library, and I would read books about Batman, the creation of Batman, not the comics, the books about him, Mm-hmm. So that's how I spent Saturday afternoon sometimes. So yeah, I just always had an interest in it, man. So now I'm just really trying to use that to benefit myself and other people that look like me.
Funny you said that, because my next question is, do you think that Hollywood really understands that black people and people of color read comic books? No, I don't think they do. I think that the comic book industry is one that there hasn't been a lot of research and a lot of market research done into the audience as much. It's not sophisticated. You know what I mean? So the amount of people buying books and what they want and that kind of stuff, it hasn't really been tracked to a real scientific level. It's very anecdotal. You know what I mean? And I think that, like, it's funny because Marvel Comics about 2 years ago had this big push
which in their opinion was a diversity push. Now, some people may argue about how they did it. They want to replace some of their more popular characters with black people, other minorities, women, which made a lot of people upset. So a lot of retailers were then like, well, I don't know if I really want to buy a book that's classified as diverse because my audience is not buying these books. Instead of linking it to a failed project and said some of these books just were not good and people didn't want to see Iron Man get replaced by a black teenager. Like, you can make a black teenage superhero, but you don't have to replace Iron Man. So some of the pushes toward diversity have been handled wrong. So I think we didn't really get a chance to see, whether that could have worked or not. But at the same time, we can't discount the phenomenon that was the Black Panther movie when it came out. This is a character who was a B character. Nobody knew who the Black Panther was. And he made $1.5 billion at the box office. Okay? It became a cultural moment. And so the question is, obviously there is a desire for people to see this kind of stuff. So it's like, how do you get the product to those people? How do you make a product that they want? How do you get it to them? Because that right there showed me there's interest for this stuff, And while it may really exist a lot at the cinema, some of that, if you gave me 1% of that, and take it to the comic book shop, that's a lot of money still, So that's my thing. I think the interest is there. I think Hollywood may kind of get it. I don't know, but I definitely think that the comic industry is still a little afraid to totally embrace a movement toward, filling their shelves with
diversity
comic books. Yeah, totally, like diversity.
But yeah, one of the things that I find fascinating is when they do create these kind of characters, these I was talking to Shawn about this idea of this 40 Acres and a Mule that you're starting to see with DC, how they're trying to, like, either they're overpowering their characters now or they're trying to put more people of color in their books, whether they're ancillary characters or principals. They're starting to add them now. I think they're they're way too late to the game at this point for people to be invested in these characters as part of the comic canon as far as pop culture is concerned. But I was curious, do you think that, looking at the success of Black Panther and looking at the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, do you think that the studios will start embracing some of these, trying to, woo or try to pull in some of these independent comic book artists that have traction?
I would hope so. I don't know how much people are really looking at the Black Panther and thinking, oh, that's a fluke. Like, I hope they don't think that. Because they'll be like, well, we made this other black thing and it didn't work. It's like, because it sucked, And that's the one thing I think people don't understand is like when they did the Steel movie with Shaquille O'Neal in it, it was not a good movie. You know what I mean? So I think if they create stuff, especially when you look at Black Panther, it's a very aspirational kind of film. It's not a film that's based in black pain. It's based in black aspiration. And I think that's what superheroes are all about, right? And even science fiction to a certain degree. So it's like, I would hope that the studios would see that, but I mean, I don't know. I think we might need a few more hits to prove that this can be something bigger than that, But it has to be handled very carefully. I mean, think about it like this. We had Luke Cage on television. We had Black Lightning. I think, I thought they were both okay. Like, I think Black Lightning is an okay show. And I think Luke Cage was an okay show. It got canceled, but it was no Black Panther. You know what I mean? It was still kind of reflecting a lot of this street stuff that, I don't know, I kind of feel like black people are kind of ready for a different aspect of our culture being on TV. Like, we've seen enough of the drug stuff, and the street stuff. It's like, can we see something different? And Black Panther was something different.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to something you said originally about your company and what you were trying to do was get away from those tropes and stereotypes. But
Yeah.
I think, it's kind of a catch-22, right? It is you speak about what you know, and if you know the streets, then that's what you produce. And if you try to create something completely different, people don't believe it.
Well, that's the thing, but that's where you have to be very careful, and that's where quality comes in. I really want to put black people on screen that I know, that I personally know. Like, I personally know people who are regular cats, but they're painters and they're, dancers and producers and writers, and they host podcasts. They do all kind of stuff. They're critics, Like, why don't we see these people? You know what I'm saying? Like, I grew up in a pretty rough city, but at the same time, that's not my lifestyle, So I think there's a way to present things to be very authentic and characters to be very real, but not be the same story that we've heard a million times.
We just heard from Carlton Hargro, co-publisher of 20th Place Media. You can find more about his company and their books on their 20th Place Media Facebook page. And that's our show. Thanks again to Shawn Martinbrough and Carlton Hargro for speaking with me, and I'd like to hear from you. Tell us about the comics you're reading or producing, or who knows, maybe we critics will be talking about your hero soon. Until next time, keep your head up.